Definitely. Wrapping up for this week's five things, we're moving into used car discussion. Point number five of DKI's five things, used car pricing dropping. Will that affect the CPI?
Yeah, so the index that we tend to look at here is the Manheim Used Vehicle Value Index. Manheim is, in my opinion, really the best aggregate determinant of the demand and pricing for used vehicles because they track everything. So like if you're a car collector, and there's a particular loved vehicle that you have your eye on, then you'll know what's going on with that car. But Manheim is for the general, the general index. And if we go back to just before COVID, the Manheim index was hanging out around 150, and it ran up during the COVID lockdowns to a little over 250. That's an increase of more than 60%. So if you needed to buy a car during those years, you were looking at prices in a year or two that were up more than 60%. That is crippling for a lot of families, right? A lot of people, they simply can't do it. And so it created all kinds of problems. And the reason for a lot of it, this actually was a supply chain issue. What happened was a lot of chip production was just difficult to get a hold of computer chips. And cars today use an enormous number of computer chips. And so what automakers were doing was they were finishing tens of thousands of cars. They had everything done but the computer chips, right? So the cars were like 99% done, but you can't sell them without the brains of the vehicle in there. And they were just parking them on lots and having them sit there. And because you couldn't get new cars into the system, everybody who needed a car was trying to buy used cars. Well, so here's what's happened. That Manheim index has declined from over 250. It's now down to right around 200. And so about half of the increase during the COVID years has been worked off. And that's, used vehicle prices are still high, and they're still very high compared to where we were, just 3 or 4 years ago. But compared to where we were a year or two ago, they've come down a lot. And so the question is this going to affect the CPI? Can it matter that much? And to make things, even worse, is used cars and trucks are 2.5% of the CPI. That's the consumer price index. So, it's really easy to say, does this matter, right? If it's only 2.5% of the index, right, who cares, right? Well, it actually does matter. And here's why. What we've had in the last year is about a reduction in the index of about 9% for a year ago. Let's just call it, 10% for rounding at 2.5% of the index. Wait a minute. That's more than 0.2%. And, one of the things we've seen, and we've talked about this, is when the CPI is announced, if they make or miss the expectation by 0.1%, the market trades off of that. The market views a 0.1% change in the consumer price index as significant enough that the S&P 500, the NASDAQ in particular, are going to move on that. The Federal Reserve is looking at that. People base their predictions of future Federal Reserve rate hikes, or in this case, rate decreases, based on the CPI. So if the Manheim index, if a reduction in the price of used vehicles moves the CPI by 2%, does that matter? Yeah, it actually does. And, it's also a huge relief for people who are looking to buy a used